Hey there, Hour of History podcast listeners. This week, our guest is Dr. Jonathan Chatwin, who has just written and published Long Peace Street, A Walk in Modern China. It is a fantastic book that takes you through the streets of Beijing and through the history, the last century of, and even more of Chinese history. You're going to enjoy the conversation and you'll definitely enjoy the book. Links and more information at hourofhistory.com. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
So, welcome to Hour of History. With me right now is Dr. Jonathan Chatwin, the author of Long Peace Street. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Stephen. Great to be here.
So, I'm always excited when a new book comes out on Asia, especially when a new book comes out that looks at it in a slightly different way. And here we have a new book on Beijing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and why you study Asia?
Sure. I mean, it was a bit of a change of direction in many ways. So I had written a PhD thesis on my namesake, a traveller called Bruce Chatwin, who was a British travel writer and novelist who died in 1989. So I had an interest in travel writing, and in 2010 I ended up slightly kind of whimsically, I suppose, moving to China. At the time, I didn't really know very much about the country outside of sort of my general knowledge, and I was finishing off writing my what then turned into a book about Bruce Chatwin whilst I was living in Shanghai, and you know, it's a fascinating place. And as I was there, I kind of started to try to investigate the history and the culture more fully, and it's become, I suppose, something of an obsession now for me. What is it? 9 years later. And I think the challenge with writing about China is that, and it's kind of a bit of a cliche, I suppose, is that it is a hard place to get to grips with. It has a long and complex history, and even in its recent past, which is sort of what my book deals more with, there are lots of complications and kind of crossroads and different paths that the country takes over the course of the sort of last century since imperial rule ended. So I was interested always with the prospect of writing about the country, but I realized that I needed to find a manageable vehicle for that. So in 2012, I ended up living, so I'd originally lived in Shanghai, and then I moved to Beijing, and I lived not far away from, just a couple of blocks south of the main avenue that runs across the city, which is in Chinese is called Chang'anjie, and you can translate it in a couple of different ways. The way that I choose to translate it in the book is as a kind of literal translation. Those words mean literally long peace street. It's a very long, very broad avenue. It's about 20 miles, or the walk that I did was about 20 miles across the city. And at its center, it crosses between the Forbidden City, which I'm sure many listeners will know is the imperial palace where generations of Chinese emperors lived. And on the other side of the road from the Forbidden City is Tiananmen Square. All along the road, there are dotted these sites of historical interest. And the name seemed to me somewhat ironic because the street has rarely been that peaceful for very long. It's been a key site of lots of different kinds of protest, whether that's sort of intellectual. Obviously, listeners will know some of the political protests that have happened along it, and also just debates around what the city was going to be after the communists took charge in 1949. There was a big debate that sort of centered around this street. So I saw the road 20 miles long as a sort of manageable way of investigating the last 110 so years of the history.
So it's a very interesting sort of avenue that you come at this from. On Hour of History, I like to have guests from a variety of backgrounds, and frequently we're talking to historians who have, done language study for years before going to China, or so on and so forth. But your background, you have a sort of appreciation for literature as well as travelers and writing in that way. Can you talk a little bit about how that might have shaped your approach in choosing walking as a method, and in choosing just sort of how you were going to tackle this massive historical problem?
Sure. I mean, walking and sort of journeys of limited scope have a pretty long history in travel writing. Some of the writers that I was looking back to, people like Patrick Leigh Fermor, who in the 1930s undertakes a famous walk across Europe. And what I like about travel writing generally, and works which take a kind of fixed and limited journey in particular, is this idea that they offer you a snapshot, and it has acknowledged limitations. I think you have to accept that. Particularly writing about China, the idea that you're writing something that is going to remain true, and you're taking a picture of something that is going to not be changing, is absurd, because the country changes so quickly that if the last 100 years of history had taught us anything, that's the case. And in a way, I quite like that about it. I like the fact that when I look back to some of the travel writing about China in the 30s and the 20s, there's a kind of it is just a snapshot of this moment, with a kind of anticipation that things are going to change. And I think there's value in that. I think that sometimes we get preoccupied with thinking about what is going to happen, making predictions about it. But actually, I wanted it to be a visual record, as much as anything else, of the city as it exists, or as it existed actually in 2016 when I did the walk. And one of the epigraphs for the book comes from George Orwell, and he said in an essay that to see what is in front of your nose requires a constant struggle. And the reason I included that was because I just really wanted to get to this idea of acknowledging and writing down, recording just the everyday scenes of Beijing as you walk through it. So in that way, it does link more into the kind of literature of travel, perhaps, than historiography, however punctuated amongst the sort of more present visual aspects of it are little historical anecdotes, and I sort of segue through a non-chronological version of China's recent history.
And one thing that's cool about the book is that you're kind of approaching it from a way that anyone who is walking through Beijing might also approach it. So they might really be able to empathize with how you're seeing it. I'm curious about your sort of methodology as you were going through. Were you writing everything down in a notebook? Were you taking a bunch of pictures? Were you stopping and writing on your laptop? How did you go about recording your thoughts?
Yeah, so I did the walk in 2016, and I was at the end of a fairly long trip in China, and I was back in Beijing, and I had set aside 3 days to do the walk. If anyone's been to China in the summer, they will know it's incredibly hot, and it was not a good, it's not a great choice of time to do a 20-mile walk across the city. So over the course of 2 days, I did the whole walk. I got a taxi out on the first morning to basically what was the end of the road. The very western edge of the avenue used to be this huge iron and steel plant, and that, when I returned there, I had been there before. When I returned there, had been all closed off. Basically, they'd knocked down huge swathes of it, and they were sort of deciding what they were going to do with it. So my taxi driver drops me off at this kind of barrier, this road barrier, and there's a policeman there. The taxi driver looks at me with real confusion because we're in a part of Beijing that most foreigners don't go to, firstly, and also, he's dropping me off in what is basically the middle of a building site. So I start from there, and I walked across to the centre to Tiananmen Square in the first day. And so I would stop and write things down. I'm a big believer in just getting stuff written down, fragments and images. I took photos as well. I think that in terms of my ambition to keep it visual and have it as a sort of documentary record, that was important. And then I would go back to the second day. I finished the walk, and over the subsequent couple of years while I was writing, I would go back when I was in town and kind of visit certain sites and look at photographs and talk to people who had lived on it. So it was a kind of accretion over time of anecdotes and images and experience of the street. But the actual walk itself was very much time limited over those 2 very hot days in August.
And you sort of mention as you start this confusion with the taxi driver, and you do bump into these situations throughout the book where you're coming into this sort of interesting space of the traveler, where you're the foreigner, the Waigoren. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was your experience, both since you've been in China and on this walking journey as the foreigner, as kind of like trying to understand this culture that's very deep in history?
Yeah, I think it's really important that if there's a number of books come out each year by Westerners on China, and I think we always have to recognize that we are, however much we learn about the culture and the language, we are literally, that the phrase you mentioned means sort of outside country people. And that is a limitation, of course it is, and you have to acknowledge that. And I didn't want to try to pretend that I had more insight than I did. I think that's a danger in writing about a country as vast in terms of history and size as China. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that the stories that we often read of China are concentrated on the major cities. And at the very end of the book, I sort of acknowledge that, this has been a walk across Beijing, but Beijing is a fraction of a percent of the landmass of the whole country, and try and acknowledge that this is a very diverse place. And I have just literally walked 20 miles of it. I think in general, these days, I've traveled a lot in rural China, and I think in those parts of the country, it's very much more you're very much more notable as an outsider, and you will get questions about where you're from and people wanting to take photos with you. And there's a much greater degree of that sort of foreigner celebrity culture outside of the major cities. In Beijing now, I think people are pretty used to seeing people who look like me, and they wouldn't be quite so curious. Although it's interesting that they do tend to be kind of tropes that you re-encounter. I'm sure this is different for Americans, but for British people, quite often things they would bring up were, in particular, the burning of the old summer palace, which the British troops undertook in 1860, and is a sort of key moment in recent Chinese history. So you would, where I describe having that conversation, but that's a conversation I've probably had, dozens of times now, with various Chinese people that I've met. So yeah, I think one thing I wanted to try and avoid actually was sort of the vox pop approach that that some books take. Obviously, a lot of books that come out of China these days are written by journalists. They tend to be the people who stay, writers who stay there for the longest periods of time. And they're very good at and very skilled and have assistants in doing interviews with Chinese people and trying to get a sort of vox pop view on the world. But it was something I wanted to stay away from. I wasn't sure that I was going to get anything particularly representative by sort of stopping and chatting in great depth to people along the route. I wanted it to be my experience that was conveyed, because I think that offers a more honest reflection of the limited nature of my experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And one of the things that we sort of tend to forget sometimes is considering, when people are talking to journalists, they're often telling journalists kind of either A, what the journalist wants to hear, or B, something that won't implicate them in any sort of problem. So there's some serious issues with that, and you kind of avoid that. But one thing you do interact with is the architecture, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because the architecture, especially along Long Peace Street, is it's both interesting, historical, and it's intentionally sending a message to foreigners. What were some of the most notable pieces of architecture, and how did you interact with them?
Yeah, so I think the story of the street really starts at the center of the city, and that space around Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City, which many visitors to Beijing will sort of day one, that'll be where they head to. And in a way, the story of the architecture along the street and of the city in general is one that it's hard not to feel a little bit of sadness when recounting, because essentially what happens is in 1949, the Communist Party take charge after a long and very bitter civil war, and obviously the Sino-Japanese War as well, from 37 to 45. And Beijing at that point isn't the capital. The capital had been moved by the nationalists in 1928. And the communists, in deciding to restore Beijing as the capital, it's an odd choice in some ways, because of course this has been the imperial capital for many preceding centuries. And the communists come to power sort of with the idea of overthrowing a lot of that feudal history. So in adopting this feudal capital, this imperial capital, they realize they're going to have to change it to reflect this new China that they are instituting. And part of that change is executed through a revision, destruction of the architecture that existed. And actually, even in the 40s, the architecture of the city was pretty well preserved. The city was in not a great state. It had been somewhat neglected, and it had been under Japanese rule for quite a period of time as well. But actually, all of the sort of different events that had conspired over the last 20 years, none of them had massively impacted on the sort of fabric of the city. So the communists took over a sort of a piece of history, really, that with the exception of things like tram lines coming in and some of the train lines coming in, was pretty much intact. They very quickly start to debate how they're going to change this city, and there's a huge debate about what they should do. The debate is, should they preserve the old city and build a new centre outside, so to the west? So there's an argument that we should keep the fabric of the imperial city and then just build an entirely new administrative centre kind of a few miles out to the west of the old town. And in the end, that plan is shelved, and the communists decide, no, we're going to take the centre of our city to be Tiananmen Square. And they start to destroy what was there. Tiananmen Square used to be a sort of T-shaped walled square with ministries, imperial ministries on either side. And anyone who's been there and even just seen photos of it will know it is now this absolutely enormous kind of granite rectangle. And all of that imperial architecture has gone, with the exception of Tiananmen Gate, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, which remains, although it's been modified, remains fairly intact as it was pre-49, because it's the place where Mao Zedong declares the foundation of the People's Republic of China. So in a way, its history has been co-opted then to become part of the CCP official narrative. But for the Communist Party in China, as for the Soviets, architecture is a really important way of announcing the newness of their vision of the world. So all along the street, we have these often kind of from the 50s things that are in a very Soviet realist style. Things that would not look out of place in Moscow, for example, the military museum as an example of that. And then from the more recent past, we have symbols of China's remarkable economic transformation since, starting in the late 70s, early 80s. So glossy bank headquarters, hotels, often designed by sort of Western architects who were drafted in, particularly in the sort of pre-Olympic era, to give a bit of sort of Western architectural glamour to the city. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition of different styles. There are fragments of the imperial left, not many, and then yes, you have this sort of architectural timeline of Communist Party history leading up to these grand gleaming skyscrapers and malls that exist out in the east of the city now.
And I find this is one of the reasons why it's so fascinating to travel to communist countries or countries that were communist, because you see this struggle that definitely went on of should we destroy it or just move in, and that's definitely there in Beijing. Now, one thing you say is that this is not just one city, and you've kind of given us a pretty good picture of that so far through the architecture. Are there other things you notice on this road that sort of that show that Beijing is at the same time not representative of all of China because it's just one city, but also it's much more than just one city?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time to be talking about Beijing because there's a huge debate going on at the moment about what sort of city the CCP wanted to become in the coming decades. I'm sure listeners will know that there is one of the key challenges that China is facing is how do you accommodate all of the people who want to move to the city from the countryside. And essentially China operates a two-tier social system whereby if you are born with residency in one of the tier one cities, so places like Beijing or Shanghai, then life is pretty good, and you can access all of the services and healthcare and education that city provides. If you are coming from outside, the rural areas outside, different provinces around China, to work in the city, you were denied access. It depends a little bit, it varies from city to city, but you were denied access to a lot of those key services. And there is a good degree, that's sort of the hard power aspect of it, but there's a good degree of just discrimination towards those groups of people. And they are marked out as visibly different to the native Beijingers and treated as such. What of course, those people are absolutely essential to the city. They are the people who have built these huge skyscrapers. They are the people who do all of the jobs that native Beijingers don't particularly want to do anymore. They man the little shops, the side street restaurants, all of these essential services that really make up the livable city. Since the last 2 or 3 years, really, the city seems to be waging war against these people. and trying them out, push them back to home provinces or to other cities. And so the character of the city is changing as a result. And it's worth, perhaps not on Peace Street as much, because the places where those people tend to live, which are the narrow alleyways or hutong, which made up the fabric of the old city, have actually almost entirely been destroyed along Peace Street. There is no evidence really of them left anymore. And hundreds of thousands of houses were destroyed to make the street as it is. But if you go north of Long Peace Street, you will still find these hutong neighborhoods where these outside people would often live in relative poverty, in old courtyard houses that have been turned into sort of shared accommodation, living a life which sits in contrast to the even within the hutong. You might have a very old dilapidated courtyard house, and a couple of doors down you have a expensively renovated example of the same thing, where one of Beijing's tech entrepreneurs live. So the contrast is acute, but the drive seems to be to make the city more, in inverted commas, civilized. That's one of the words that they use about it, and in doing so they seem to want to drive out the poorer outside people. But the question, of course, is how does the city function without those people? Because Beijing needs them. So it's an interesting time. It's not something that is there's a clear sense of where it's going to end up, but it is changing every time I go back. It's changed a little bit more. They're refurbishing the hutong to try and make them again, in inverted commas, more civilized. And I think for a lot of people like myself, it's a shame, because that was where the kind of essence and culture of the city was for a lot of people like me. However, as I say in the book, the reality is that as a foreigner, I don't have to live in those dilapidated courtyard houses. And it's easy for us to be nostalgic for that, for a mode of living that we haven't been forced into. And I mean, I always make the comparison. I live in Birmingham in England, an old industrial city, and there's a huge amount of the old Victorian terraced housing here. And I would quite happily see a lot of that be knocked down and replaced with things that are nicer to live in. So I think we can sometimes, as outsiders, view the city in a slightly more nostalgic way than native Beijingers do. And a lot of native Beijingers I talk to about the way the city is changing are quite pleased that the alleyways are being cleaned up.
And it is an interesting place, especially considering how, if you have money, you can kind of make these things nicer, these old buildings in these old areas. But for a lot of people, it's a real struggle, and they don't have the resources to do that. That's not unique to sort of the alleyways either. You talk about some of these historically important places like Shanghai, where Mao was hosting dances, and now Xi Jinping lives. So it seems like party officials do this as well. How much access do you have to these sort of places along Peace Street, where some of the top party officials are living and operating?
Basically none. That they, I think, for a lot of people visiting the city, actually, they would not even know what the places are. I mean, Zhongnanhai, the entrance is just along to the west from Tiananmen, and you know it's something important because there are all guys with dark sunglasses outside. It's got a very official look to it, but there's no suggestion of what this place actually is, and there are walls all the way around it. So in comparison to something like, for example, the White House, sort of visible symbol of the American presidency, the Chinese Communist Party is literally hidden away behind high walls. And I mean, it's interesting in a way that they chose Zhongnanhai as the sort of the center of CCP rule. It is just next door to the Forbidden City, and was essentially an imperial garden, part of the imperial sort of palace area in old Beijing. So it's a place that has a long imperial history. So in a way, it seems a surprising choice. But I mean, Mao, when he lived there, did seem to understand that there was danger in inhabiting these imperial palaces, and apparently, I don't know whether this is true, but the anecdote says that he never went into the Forbidden City itself, and for fear it had some sort of innate corrupting power. But I think what's interesting about I talk in the book about the way in which he, particularly with Mao being isolated in the way that he was behind the walls of Zhongnanhai, he became, I mean, you referenced the balls that they used to have, and some of his eccentric personal habits, which were already in evidence even before they took power, became exaggerated. And there are anecdotes about how much, for example, he loved swimming. Swimming was a big part of his sort of personal mystique, and he actually ended up moving into the building where the swimming pool at Zhongnanhai was housed, and he would often take meetings while sort of floating around in the pool, and he would summon his underlings to come and visit him there. And his personal eccentric behavior, as is often the case when you're kind of sequestered behind in a place of separate luxury from the rest of the country, his personal habits became more and more eccentric towards the end of his life. But yeah, I mean, it's true that across the whole city, any sensitive sites, I passed by as well, the Diaoyutai State Guest House, which is where foreign leaders are housed when they come to Beijing, and that is equally difficult to gain access to, and there is no sense, as perhaps there is in Britain and in America, that these are places that the people should have perhaps limited access to, but should have access to as a sort of right of, this is their government and the government should be visible to the people. That is very much an anathema to the CCP.
And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about travel writing, that, you say it's right there, but walking by, you wouldn't really know what it is. But in reading your book, you kind of get the history and you get some of these stories of places that you might not understand. One of the things that I find challenging about travel writing is the way you write about the Forbidden City really makes me want to go there. It's vividly described, and you can pull the history out of the Forbidden City. Unfortunately, when I was at the Forbidden City, I couldn't pull that history out of my own soul. I didn't feel the same way. I felt like I was just being kind of toured through a place. Can you talk about that, sort of contradiction? Like how do you find that sort of, is that the writer's eye? Where are you getting that magic from? Because sometimes these places do seem ordinary to travelers.
Yeah, I think that phrase about magic is quite a good one, in the sense that it is a bit of a trick. I think that travel writers would love for their readers to sincerely believe that as they wander through these places, their sort of internal stream of consciousness narrative is all this kind of wonderful history, and they're able to access it on the spot as they move around these spaces. And the reality is, of course, a lot of that is done after the fact, in terms of teasing out the stories of the place and then deciding which stories you actually want to tell. The Forbidden City is a great example of that, I think, in that anybody who has been there will probably have anticipated their experience of it being, maybe I'm imposing my own experience onto others, but will have anticipated it with a kind of sense of grandeur and awe. But actually, when you get in there, firstly, you have to go through what is a pretty painful experience of just trying to get a ticket, and these huge queues of people, the just native Chinese people who want to see this imperial palace. You've got to kind of fight your way through the crowds, and then you get in, and it's absolutely crammed with people. There is no sense of the history as narrative as you walk through it. I don't think they have some informative signs, some of which are in Chinese and some of which are in English, but they're pretty limited in terms of what they tell you, apart from just the dates of when things were built and potentially what the buildings were used for. So I think as you sort of pass through, there is symbolic importance to everything you see, but for people outside of Chinese culture, accessing what that symbolic significance is and understanding it is really, really hard. And what I do in the book is I take four separate days, significant days, well, 3 of them significant days in the history of the Forbidden City, and I try and use that as a way of giving a sense of some of the narratives that have taken place in the recent past there. But yeah, I agree. I think I think readers of travel literature probably, it's worth bearing in mind that or certainly from my personal experience, a lot of the narratives that are spun are not coming from some sort of exceptional lived experience. They come from, hopefully enough to not be completely bamboozled by the place you're visiting, but a lot of it comes after the fact, I think.
And I think that was one of the things it really enriched my travel experiences, reading travel literature before I go, and just even literature itself. And then you do sort of, it helps you to put on the magic glasses when you are at some of these places, because we do need it sometime. But one of the things you kind of challenge us with is this question of, does a surplus of history cultivate indifference to it? And I think that's just a fantastic question. How do we struggle with that? How does too much history sometimes deaden the whole experience to it? How did you see the Chinese interacting with this street? And did you feel it yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably 2 things to say about that. Firstly, of course, the Chinese, or particularly the Chinese Communist Party, like to emphasize the notion of the country's 5,000 years of continuous civilization and history, which is in itself, a bit of a fabrication. China does have an extremely long history. I think 5,000 years is a bit of an exaggeration if you're talking about what they often want, which is that it is an unbroken line. China over those millennia has changed hugely in terms of what that landmass actually contains and means. The reality is, I think, that in the post-1949 era, that sort of does signal a break with the past, and there are a number of things that happen over the particularly subsequent 2 decades, which means that the fabric of old China, imperial China, has gone. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. The revision of the city that I've talked about, which happened across the country, where city walls were taken down, traditional houses and temples were destroyed in rebuilding this new socialist country. That means that there is less evidence of the old past in China today, and that's a shame. But of course, it's in a way that's not the CCP being indifferent to it. It's actually them being actively hostile towards it, and particularly during the Cultural Revolution, there was an explicit aim, which was to wipe away the 4 olds, as it was called, and get rid of evidence of the feudal past. The trouble is now that actually the preeminent motivator behind them sort of raising their history isn't political as much as commercial. So there are what sort of was remained after the period of the Cultural Revolution. So that the Cultural Revolution runs, generally it's accepted from about 66 to 76. After that period, what remains historically is often destroyed in the pursuit of commercial opportunity. So in Beijing, that's evident where the quote you reference is talking about this enormous sort of shopping mall / office block that was built just to the east of Tiananmen Square. And as they're building it, they discover all of this evidence of Paleolithic existence. And then they kind of have forced to decide, well, hang on, what does this mean for our plans to build this kind of very expensive mall? And generally speaking, what happens is they may preserve bits of it, and that's certainly what happened there. But they do just kind of carry on regardless. And so there is a tension now between preserving the past and the pursuit of commercial opportunity, and that and the latter seems to generally win out. So we talked about the hutong and the old courtyard housing. Apart from some small areas where those are being deliberately conserved now, that style and mode of living and style of architecture is becoming a thing of the past in the city. And there are very few markers really of what Beijing used to be as one of the finest walled cities anywhere in the world.
Which is interesting to see in comparison to other sort of national capitals, like even Seoul or something like that. But we're coming up on 70 years now of communist rule. It's the 30 years since Tiananmen Square. Throughout your book, there's this theme of Beijing as kind of a city of like revolt and conflict and protest. Would you say that's still fair to describe Beijing as a city with that, or is that gone now?
That's a very good question, and you're right that. I mean, I think it's important to say that with some of the protests I reference, and this would include those in 1989, Beijing was not the only city where protests took place, but the revolutionary spirit of the city has often come from its students, as is the case across the world, I suppose. And the Communist Party have co-opted some of this history. So, for example, the May 4th movement, which is named after a protest that takes place on the 4th of May 1919, where students come together to protest the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles, where China is basically denied sovereignty of a part of Shandong, which was held under German rule, and people gather to. It was held under Japanese rule and was then handed over to German rule. People gathered to protest that and protest the Japanese interference. It is an important moment in the revolutionary history of the country. What's interesting is that the Chinese Communist Party have taken that moment, along with a number of other kind of protest moments which precede 1949, and they've kind of tried to draw a straight line between them to show a sort of teleological progression towards 1949 as sort of the eventual outcome of all of these popular protests. It's pretty dodgy historiography, but that's the narrative they've constructed. Obviously, then through particularly the 1970s and 1980s, you have a number of protests cropping up, which are arguing for greater freedoms. They tend to be labeled as part of a so-called democracy movement, and that's a sometimes misleading title, in that not everybody there was united in wanting a sort of Western style of democracy. I think that's often what people outside of China believe to be true, but often it was about greater personal freedom and the ability to control their lives in lots of ways, big and small. And of course, 1989 and the events of early June there do mark an end point to that. I was talking to a Chinese filmmaker who came to prominence. His name is Wu Wenguang, and he made a film in the late 1980s about the artists and students of Beijing. And I was asking him, how did he feel that the city had changed and the kind of culture amongst young people had changed in the subsequent 30 years, and he still lives in the city. And he sort of said that those days felt a long way behind now. And in terms of the radical spirit that he recorded in some of his work, that doesn't exist in quite the same way.
And that seems like a theme. Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
That seems like a theme that we find almost universally in big commercial cities.
So, sorry, just say that again. It broke up a little bit there.
Oh, yeah. It seems like this theme of this loss of the radical tradition and just the city as sort of a space where these kind of extraordinary actions are happening, certainly in the most prominent metropolitan commercial cities, is a thing of the past globally.
Sure. I think that idea of kind of student radicalization has changed enormously in the last 10 years, although I suppose it's interesting that we talk this week after seeing tens of thousands, a million people on the streets of Hong Kong protesting the extradition treaty. I think that sometimes people talk about Chinese people in general as kind of having an instinctive predilection towards the status quo and towards autocratic rule. And I think anybody watching Hong Kong this week will know that is just simply not true. The reality is that, you know, from my experience talking to young Chinese people, they are pragmatic. I don't think that the fact that protest spirit perhaps isn't quite as visible means that people are satisfied with what is going on. I think it just means that they understand that the risks are pretty enormous in trying to step out and do anything to signal their collective dissent. But it's a very interesting question and one which a lot of writers on contemporary China are trying to kind of figure out the answer to is or not even figure out, that sounds like there is an answer to it, but try and investigate and kind of get some sense of. But just to reference what you said earlier, which I think is really true, is that Westerners asking that question, you're very unlikely to get an honest response, I think. And that's the challenge, I guess.
Yeah, and there are a lot of challenges, and it seems like quite a few people are taking them up. You mentioned earlier on that there is this great, just a huge catalog of books coming out on China, and they're frequently written by journalists who have lived there for a long time and who rely heavily on personal interviews. You've taken sort of a slightly different path, getting your PhD first, and you're writing, with an academic press, and you've already done sort of academic work, but then you kind of changed it up, I guess, and went to live in China. One of the things that I like to talk about on Hour of History is sort of how people get where they are, and sort of like advice you might have for people who are reading these books and say, oh, I'd love to go do this in Karachi, Pakistan or something. What was your path, and what sort of advice do you have for people who might be academics or might be thinking about academia or want to be travel writers, whatever?
I took as you sort of acknowledged, a slightly eccentric path towards travel writing. That said, I think I was never a particularly natural fit for traditional academia. So I wrote my PhD thesis about a single author, which is a kind of slightly not unfashionable thing to do, but frowned upon. And I think that for me, I was always passionate about the work I was writing about, and trying to illuminate for readers a little bit more about these texts and the life of the writer in particular. In terms of advice about travel writing, I find that it's actually very much about making sure you record as much as possible. If your ambition is to write a book, as you say, about Karachi, you need to go and you need to spend a decent amount of time there. That's obviously a given. But I think sometimes people can be worried about the validity of their experience, and about writing things down before, they feel that it has a kind of heft and weight of experience. And actually, I think with places that are not your own, you have to just accept that you're going to, at some point, if you are going to produce a piece of writing on them, you're going to have to accept that your perspective is limited. That the tools, the skills that you require to understand the place, and those might be linguistic skills, they might be historical skills, they are tools to produce something at the end of it, because otherwise you just end up feeling this sense of impossibility in the task. And there's a cliche about writing on China in particular: the longer you spend there, the less you can write with any certainty. And that is true to an extent, but at some point you've just got to accept the limitations and go for it. Otherwise, no one would ever write anything. And I think that's one of the challenges today in particular, is that I suspect that that contemporary culture does make people more reluctant to commit themselves on paper, because there's so many people out there who are ready to tell you you're wrong, and that's ever been thus. I mean, in the study that I wrote about Bruce Chatwin, he writes an incredibly famous book called The Songlines about Aboriginal culture. It's probably even, it was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller and a hugely successful book internationally. He spent actually not very long living in Australia amongst these people. And of course, all of the experts who spent 30 years working with Aboriginal communities, quite rightly in some ways, were upset that the book that cuts through is the book that is by this guy who's just spent 3 months traveling around there. But there is value, I think what sometimes academic historians perhaps, I think maybe don't realize is the wrong way of putting it, but there is value in limiting one's experience as well, in the sense that for most people who, example, are interested in India or interested in China, they're not going to go out and read a hefty academic tome on on that country. And there is value to the accessible kinds of literature that that we've talked about in terms of some of the journalistic work coming out of China. I think that, so for my advice, is have faith that what you see and what you write down has value, does have significance, while simultaneously acknowledging that it is of course limited individual experience to some extent.
Absolutely, it's great advice. And now, this is like sort of the inevitable question, but also one that like must be frustrating after you finish like this long work. But China has a lot of streets that are named similarly in almost every city. Is this the beginning of a long Peace Street series? Are you going to go do the Chang'anjies everywhere in China?
I mean, you're right that pretty much every street, pretty much every street in the world, right, has that significant street that is the one. I was staying with a friend in Berlin, and he took me down, their equivalent there, and certainly London has it. And yeah, I mean, as a kind of way of investigating history, I do like it. No, my next project though, I'm back in China in about 4 weeks, doing a long trip. Partly to talk about the book in some places, but also I am pursuing a story based on the southern tour of Deng Xiaoping. So Deng Xiaoping is the leader of China through the reform period of the late 70s and 80s into the very early 90s. And in the early 90s, he goes, by this point, he's very old. He goes round the south on a southern tour, which is an idea that comes from the old imperial days, where the emperor would go out to sort of inspect his kingdom from the northern capital in Beijing, and would travel around the south. And he went out to inspect, Deng Xiaoping went around to inspect these sites, these special economic zones, and these places where the reform and opening that was going on was most kind of turbocharged. And he does that in order to kind of reaffirm the country's commitment to this process of economic development. So I'm tracing his route through the south and up to Shanghai over a few weeks, with the intention that then that turns into a book at some point.
Very
so
cool.
that's the plan. But of course, as with all such projects, it very much depends on where things take me when I'm on the ground.
Very cool. And we'll definitely keep an eye out for that and have a link to your tour dates just in case some of our listeners are also in Asia. Well, we do have listeners in Asia, just in case they're around where you are speaking. Now, unfortunately, we're nearing the end of this enjoyable conversation, but we get to the suggestion part, which is always one of my favorite parts. If you could suggest something to the Hour of History podcast listeners, what would it be?
So I thought about this a bit. I had a look at some of what your other guests had suggested, an eclectic mix of things, and I decided I wasn't going to recommend. My go-to would be to recommend some books, but I thought I would stay away from that. What I thought would be a nice recommendation to give listeners a sense of the modern China we've been talking about are some contemporary films and the work of a director who I admire enormously. Some listeners may already know the name. His name is Jia Zhangke, and he is, I would say, certainly one of the most prominent Chinese filmmakers working today. He has a new film out, which I saw a few weeks ago, called, I think the English title is Ashes, the Purest White. And a couple of his previous films, Mountains Made Apart and A Touch of Sin, are also fantastic. And just wonderful portraits of contemporary China for anybody who wants to get a sort of a window into the culture. They're quite bleak in some ways, but excellent visual introductions and narrative introductions into modern China.
Very cool. Mine is kind of similar to that, and I too also, tend to recommend books. But I, as a sufferer of bibliomania, where I just buy books endlessly that I may never read, but hopefully will. Whatever, I'm going to suggest a book so they can complement your film. It's along the same idea of getting a sense for a place. I think one of the best ways to get a sense for a place that you're going to travel to is not only through travel literature or dense academic literature, but also through crime. And the great Akashic Noir series takes local authors and local artists and does these sort of crime collections. So they have cities all over the world now, and a few collections for some of the more prominent cities. So there's like 3 or 4 volumes of New York noir series. And it's just a great way to get a sense of the city because the neighborhoods are described in such detail. And it's really cool way to look at a city as a unit. Yeah.
That sounds great. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big, when I'm not reading dense works of Chinese history, I like crime fiction as a good escape. And I completely agree as a way of getting under the skin of a city. It's an excellent vehicle.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure, Jonathan, having you on, and it's certainly a pleasure to read your book, and I think everyone should do it, Long Peace Street, A Walk in Modern China. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to talk to you.
All right. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.